For those of you who were here last night, I learned something very important about my background that I did not know before, which is I am Lee Miller's long-lost brother, Roger Miller. Jay Epstein will never live this down, I think, although he had a conversation with his wife who said, Roger Miller, king of the road. So we're all good. What I want to do for just 30 seconds or even less is thank Jay and Sandy and Joy for, again, doing a phenomenal job in keeping this summit relevant, first of all. Watching the evolution of the summit is, by itself, this is probably my fifth or so time being here, and the good feeling that's in the room. And again, you know, as we've said many times, it's not about us. It's really about the industry and how the industry interacts with itself. So, most of the people on this panel don't need any introduction. And by the way, let me say at the beginning, this is going to be an interactive panel, and Bill Daly, who is the moderator of the panel, will likely leave time for questions and engage people and so on and so forth. So Senator Mitchell, as you know, partner and chairman of DLA from 2003 to 2008, U.S. Special Envoy to the Middle East, Senate Majority Leader, Good Friday Peace Agreement for which he won the Presidential Medal of Freedom, Major League Baseball, Penn State moderator, overseer of the American Red Cross Liberty Fund to help victims from the September 11th terrorist attack, former chairman of the board of directors of the Walt Disney Company, and in 2008, Time magazine named him one of the 100 most influential people in the world. I think the thing today that he's most proud of that I've heard him talk about is actually the Alliance for the Bangladesh Worker Safety, which he's most recently done, where he brought together 26 major group retailers with antitrust laws always in mind, to develop and launch the Bangladesh Worker Safety Initiative. Secretary Cohn, well known to all of you as CEO of the Cohn Group, with whom DLA has an exclusive partnership, obviously also has a tremendous record of accomplishments. In 1974, he was named as one of America's 200 future leaders, which indeed he became. You could see that they were prescient. He was in the Senate, chairman of the Armed Services Committee, government oversight, and then, as you know, he became Secretary of Defense under President Clinton and has had various interests, including the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the School for Advanced International Studies, the Brookings Institute, and so on and so forth. He's a published author, and reportedly, although he denies this, an accomplished athlete, and he's on the board of CBS. Ambassador Grossman, I would suspect many of you would not want the postings that he's had recently. 30 years in the Foreign Service, he joined the Cohn Group as well. He was the special representative in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and he was his Kissinger Senior Fellow, Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, U.S. Ambassador to Turkey, also managed U.S. policy in the Balkans and Colombia, and promoted a key expansion of the NATO alliance. Bill Daly, obviously well known to the Chicago folks, managing partner and head of U.S. operations for Argentière Capital. Did I pronounce that right? Great. Prior to that, he was President Obama's chief of staff from January 11 to 12, vice chairman of JP Morgan Chase, president of SBC Communications from 2001 to 2004, chaired Vice President Gore's presidential campaign, Secretary of Commerce under President Clinton, as well as special counsel to President Clinton, where he coordinated the successful campaign to pass NAFTA. Prior to his public service, he was a partner in a lesser-known firm named Mayer Brown, president and COO of Amalgamated Bank, and a lawyer in an extremely well-known firm of Daly and George. Serves on the corporate boards of Abbott, Boeing, Boston Properties, EDS, and Merck. He was co-chair of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Center for Capital Markets Competitiveness, and highly, obviously, as well as all of you well know, his involvement in community affairs in this area is probably unparalleled. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Bill. You obviously have an extraordinary opportunity to hear from people who are at the cutting edge of what's going on, and I wish you a very successful rest of the conference.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Let me just take an opportunity to thank DLA for the opportunity for me to sit with three people who I have great admiration for, and have the chance also to listen to them. You've got a heck of a lot of experience on this dais in foreign affairs, domestic policy, politics, business. They understand the world as well as any group of people anywhere. But let me also thank DLA for their involvement in the civic life of Chicago, the charitable life as an organization and as individuals, like so many of you in your cities. They have done well and they do a lot of good. And that involvement, they're one of the premier, obviously, law firms, but they're also one of the premier organizations involved in the civic and charitable life of this city and make it as great of a city as those of us who live here believe it is. So thank you, Lee, and Alan, and so many partners from DLA who are here and asked me to do this. You've got a lot of, as I mentioned, experience, foreign policy, economics. Let me start off by asking Senator Mitchell and Secretary Cohn, both having been in Congress, obviously the Senate, and George as the majority leader. And I see Tom Daschle, who I know is on another panel in a while. Let me get some of the domestic politics out of the way early for those who may have an interest. We have an election coming up shortly. What's your predictions and what real impact will there be in trying to break this dysfunction or gridlock or whatever you want to call it that seems to have paralyzed Washington and our federal government, at least recently? George?
Well, historically, of course, the party of the president in his second term has not done well in the midterm elections, and it looks as though at this point this election will be consistent with that historic precedent. I think there's not much doubt the Republicans will control the House of Representatives again, and I think the odds of their gaining control of the Senate are probably at least 50-50, perhaps a little bit better right now. And so if that does happen, I think it will most likely perpetuate and extend the gridlock and dysfunction that you described through the last 2 years of the president's term. I wish that weren't the case, but I think that is the reality.
Bill?
No, I agree. I think the Republicans will even increase their margin in the House, and I think that they are likely to take over the Senate. What does that mean? It means 2 more years of what Francis Fukuyama has a piece in the Foreign Affairs magazine you might want to take a look at, because the title of his piece is called Decay and Dysfunction. And those are 2 words which pretty much sum up what's happening in Washington. We're going to have 2 more years of stagnation. Very little will take place, and we'll all be kind of gearing up for 2016 with the hope that someone on a white horse will come in and change things in Washington. I don't think that will happen, and frankly, I'm a little more discouraged about what I see taking place. I wish I could be more hopeful, but frankly, the country is divided, at least politically. I don't think so as far as Americans are concerned, but politically, we are deeply divided along those red state, blue state lines.
Mark, you've been stationed in parts of the world, obviously, that are very difficult. At a time when this dysfunction seems to have been at a level that many of us have never seen in our lifetime, how do people around the world view that, and therefore view our government and your being able to do the job the president asked you to do?
Well, it matters a lot. And to go to your exact question is, people worry about it. I mean, they need the United States of America to be strong. They need the United States of America to be a leader. And so they see this dysfunction and they wonder what's happening and who is going to be the indispensable nation, who's going to take on some of these hard jobs that have to be done around the world. And I'll give you a couple of, one sort of general answer, one more specific. The general answer is, as you say, when you represent the United States abroad, what do you represent? Well, what you represent is a strong country. And when I talk to new Foreign Service officers, what do I tell them? I tell them, watch the debate about healthcare in the United States. Watch the questions of infrastructure in the United States. Watch the questions of education in the United States, because it's through our strength that allows you to be strong abroad. And so it matters a very great deal. I'll give you a specific answer if you'd allow me. And that is that the dysfunction in Washington today is at the moment holding back over 40 career ambassadors who are stuck in the Senate. They've had their hearings, they've been voted out of the Senate, and they're sitting on the Senate floor. And they can't get going and go out and represent the United States of America precisely because of this dysfunction. And you might say, well, that's a small thing, what's it matter to me? Well, what it matters to you is those of you who do business abroad, if you go to country X or country Y, you want an ambassador there to help you. I read the other day, somebody said, well, it's no big deal, it's just Sierra Leone. Well, Ebola, ambassador, large problems in Sierra Leone. And so I'd like this dysfunction at least to kind of get this job done, and let's get some representatives of the United States out there and to help us do our foreign policy and our domestic business.
George, we'll start with you. Obviously, the events in Ukraine and our relationship with Russia has seemed to deteriorate rather quickly, and a very far cry from the reset attempt which was made by the administration in 2009 when President Obama came in office. In light of this conflict and the escalating sanctions, what's your prognosis for U.S. business in Russia and the long-term impact on their economy, and also the long-term impact on foreign investment in Russia?
I think the immediate impact, of course, is negative. There will be, I think, further sanctions imposed on Russia, and so for the short term, it will be a very difficult period. Over the long term, I think it will be of lesser consequence because I think Russia will be of lesser consequence. When President Putin first took office, he said that one of his great concerns was that for the first time in 200 or 300 years, Russia might slip into the second or third rank of nations. That's the characterization he used. And the reality is that is well on the way. By the middle of this century, the population of India will reach 1.8 billion. The population of the United States will reach 440 million, while the population of Russia will decline. It has been in decline steadily for some period of time. They've taken major efforts, the government has, to arrest that decline and have slowed it down a little bit, but Russia will have a relatively small population and a modest economy by mid-century. And the further problem they have is that the composition of the population is changing as the number of Slavs decreases sharply and the number of Muslims increase, and they have a problem with their Muslim population along the southern border of Russia. Secondly, they face very serious economic problems. 55% of Russia's national revenue comes from a direct tax on oil and gas. And the break-even point for their national government's budget is oil at $110 a barrel. There are very few experts in the oil industry who now project that price at any point over the near future, unless there is a major war in the Middle East which disrupts supplies over a lengthy period of time. Recently, the U.S. Department of Energy projected prices at about $92 a barrel over the next few years, and several private oil economists criticized the Energy Department for overestimating what the price would be. So Russia faces very serious problems. I think that Putin will probably succeed in hanging on to Crimea. He is trying hard now to destabilize Ukraine and may succeed to some extent in that, but he's not going to be able to recreate anything resembling the Soviet Empire and will face this constant pressure from severe financial crisis, declining population, and declining influence around the world. And they have a problem, Russia, China, and India, really, in comparison to us. All of them have hostile neighbors on their borders. Russia has a large number of countries on its borders, almost all of whom are directly hostile to them. India and China face the same problem. They're sort of our competitors. We, on the other hand, have neighbors on our borders who are, by comparison, very friendly. Nobody envisions a U.S.-Canada war or a U.S.-Mexico war anytime soon. And so, in a sense, we're much better positioned going forward than any of our major competitors. And I think the least severe of which will be Russia by the time you get a few decades into the future.
But and I'll ask Bill and Mark to comment on this. Based upon what you just said, would you not put then Russia, considering their capabilities, at least militarily, and the sort of history, and when you put somebody in such a negative corner as you're projecting they will be in a possibly relatively short period, would they not be up there as the real potential danger point in foreign policy over the next 5 to 10 years?
Yes, yes. Angry, frustrated, to a certain degree humiliated by the events of recent years. Putin said that the collapse of the Soviet Union was one of the great catastrophes of recent times, and so it's understandable that they are falling back on anger and lashing out, and combine that with their substantial nuclear arsenal and their military capability. I think you're quite right. I think it is a danger in the short-term future, and I think one that we must deal with very carefully.
No?
Well, as usually, the junior senator from Maine has taken all the time and my arguments from the senior senator from Maine. I think the short answer to your first question was, to this group, it's probably not a good thing to invest in Russia in the short term, long term, because they're on a steady state of decline. But I agree with Senator Mitchell in terms of his analysis and the point that Bill just made and answered by Senator Mitchell. That's something we should be concerned about. You heard Nick Burns talk last night, saying that we have to work with China and we have to work with Russia. We can't afford to have Russia be seen or be a failed state. That's not in our interest. Same thing China and elsewhere. But there is a trend going on in this world, a trend towards nationalism. It's taking place somewhat in China. It's certainly taking place in Japan. It's certainly taking place in Russia. And that is not good for world peace. And so we've got to find a way to deal with Russia at this time when Putin is bloating out his chest, sticking a finger in the eye of the West. We still have to find a way for an off-ramp for him in dealing with us. Now, that comes at a time when President Obama looks pretty weak internationally. Notwithstanding our supremacy on the military capability and economy, nonetheless, the perception of us drives other people's attitudes. And when we are seen as being weak, it's going to be hard for President Obama to make a deal with Russia, letting him back away from the corner in which, as Senator Mitchell is saying, he's painting himself into. So that's going to be a real challenge in the coming 2 years with Obama, certainly, how we manage that relationship with Russia. And I don't think at this point we can just do it. Can Putin sit down with President Obama and work this out? I think it has to be in a much larger context. And I'll say one quick thing about why perceptions matter. About 4 years ago, I was at the Chinese embassy, and the foreign minister was there, Chinese foreign minister, and he had a young delegation with him, some young, bright people. And I turned to one of the young men beside me. I said, "What do you really think about the United States?" He said, "We think you're a colossus with clay feet," which was pretty direct and un-Chinese-like, frankly. I had not had that kind of directness in the past, but that's changing. They're very direct now. And I said, "Well, why do you say that?" He said, "Because number one, you made a mistake in going into Iraq. Number two, you were unsuccessful in carrying out the mission. You've been there a long time. Number three, you had Katrina strike. And we know that you can't control Mother Nature, but you were ill-prepared to deal with the consequence of major proportions. And number four, you brought us a subprime mortgage disaster. You are no longer the masters of the universe." That was all said within a minute. And it reflected a growing sentiment on the part of other countries as they look at us, as they look at this dysfunction, and see that Congress, when Ambassador Grossman says we have to go out and try to persuade them, what are we persuading them to do? To be more like us? To be more like the United States that hasn't made a decision in 4 years and is unlikely to make a major decision for the next 2 years at least? Very hard to persuade countries to be more like Mike when Mike isn't doing very well. And so all of this portends for us a very difficult time in the years ahead, especially with President Obama going to speak tomorrow night, try to recalibrate how we deal with this changing environment at a time when the perception, not the reality, the perception is we're inconstant, we're unreliable, and we don't have a plan and haven't had one, a strategic plan. So I think it's a very challenging time for us, and Putin is only part of the problem.
We may want the wait staff to take the knives away from everybody.
This is all off the this is all off the record, right?
Yeah, I know. Back there, not a video. Mark? Yes, I'm actually starting to get depressed as well from last night and tonight. 3 things, if I could. One is, I think it's really important, as both Senator Mitchell and Senator Cohen have said, to understand kind of where the Russians are coming from. But let's be careful here. Let's be careful that we don't understand so much that we start to feel guilty about what happened at the end of the Cold War, which was that NATO and the European Union took in countries who wanted to join those alliances. And sometimes I see people on television and they say, oh, this is just terrible what happened after the Cold War. What were we going to do? We were going to leave those countries in a borderland. We weren't going to stand up for people who wanted to participate in a free way of life. We were going to say to Poles and Hungarians in the Czech Republic, oh, well, sorry, we're not going to do this for you, even though you're ready to follow our values, be with us, be part of it. So I understand, and I think understanding is an important thing, but I don't want it to kind of stretch into the fact that we suddenly feel guilty about expanding some of these structures. I recognize my bias, but I think we have to stand up for our values here. Second thing is, and maybe you'll find this a little bit more optimistic, I also agree with both senators that there's something to do now to answer Putin, yes, answer others who are challenging, yes, but some of that, I think, is really within our own capacity. So when I think about Ukraine, well, first is to strengthen NATO, and I think what happened in Wales over the past 2 or 3 days seems like there's a reinvigoration of that alliance, a very important thing as far as I'm concerned. But step back, and that is to say, how are we going to get stronger? Well, I'll give you 2 examples. We've talked a little bit in this conference and a little bit last night about the energy revolution in this country. Well, part of an answer to Mr. Putin in Ukraine is the Keystone Pipeline. It's starting to export some natural gas and oil from the United States of America. To say we've got some power here as well, and the energy revolution is part of that. And the third thing, and this, it seems to me, ought to be of very great interest to people in business. Again, I look out there and I say, how would I get stronger faster if I was running the United States of America? I'd make a dash for a signed and ratified, if I could get it, transatlantic trade and investment partnership. Want to answer Mr. Putin? Well, let's make the transatlantic relationship, particularly on the economic side, stronger. And the stronger we are, the more thought he's got to make every time he walks up to one of these decisions. So yes, it's a lot about him, but we can strengthen ourselves here as well.
Obviously, we've had a war and civil war in Syria going on for the last number of years with hundreds of thousands of victims. We have the recent declaration of ISIS, of the establishment of an Islamic State, the Israel-Gaza conflict, which was quite an extensive operation by Israel, an enormous impact. So the Middle East, in addition to Ukraine, obviously, is a difficulty, but the Middle East probably has been, and maybe remain for quite a while, the hotspot. And each of these individuals have enormous experience, understanding. So I would kind of open it, George, starting with you to give sort of an overview and how you see where it's at, to some degree how we got here, and a realistic sort of sense of how you see this playing out over the next number of years. Obviously, we know tomorrow the president's going to speak about ISIS and how we may be able to handle them if it is possible. But I think the audience would really like a broad view of where you see it, the Middle East.
Well, Nick Burns last night gave an excellent talk discussing that and other issues, and I will try not to repeat everything that Nick said, but to supplement that with a few additional comments. With respect to ISIS, let me tell a short story and use it as a basis to make a couple of points. In the spring of 1920, a Sunni tribal chief in northern Iraq, the area in which ISIS is now operating, ignited a revolution against British rule by personally killing the high-ranking British military official in that region. His name was Sheikh al-Dara. His grandson is now the Sunni tribal chief in that same region, who is working with ISIS because of his tribe's opposition and the Sunni tribe's opposition to what they perceive as the sectarian Shia government of Iraq under Prime Minister Maliki, in their view, established and imposed by the United States. At the same time, the Shias rose in the south, and the Shia tribal leader was al-Sadr, whose grandson is now the leader of the largest Shia militia in the south. To make 3 points. First, this is a very old conflict. It didn't begin last year or the year before, the last decade. It's been going on for hundreds of years. Secondly, we have to keep reminding ourselves that in that part of the world, religious, tribal, and family relationships have far more to do with personal identity than the nation. It controls how people act. Third, it is no coincidence that where ISIS is successful is in Sunni-dominated areas where they have a receptive population, because that population perceives their national government, both Iraq and Syria, as minority or Shia-dominated partisan and sectarian governments unwilling to share power with the Sunnis, who in Syria are the vast majority, who in Iraq are a substantial minority, who have themselves long ruled. So an essential element of our policy in Iraq has to be the establishment of a broadly based, truly national government which will be inclusive of all clans. We cannot have a repetition of the Shia-dominated government. It's understandable that Shia, having been dominated and oppressed by Sunnis for centuries, will, once they gain power, seek to do the same. But the fact is, it's not in their interest and it's not in their national interest. This can't be done solely by American military power. People say, well, if we had just stayed in Iraq 5 more years, or 10 more years, or 20 more years. The fact is, there's no evidence that just staying there and imposing ourselves will cause the result to be any different whenever we do leave. There has to be an internal dynamic among the people themselves. Right now, of the 7 billion people on Earth, 1 in 5 is Muslim, about 1.25 billion. By the year 2060, less than half a century away, the United Nations projects that there'll be nearly 10 billion people in the world, and 1 in 3 will be Muslim. 3.5 billion people. To put that in perspective, that was the total population of the world as recently as 1970. And the internal strains within Islam, the Sunni-Shia conflict, the conflict between fundamentalists and moderates, the conflict between Sunni-dominated governments and Sunni extremist opposition groups like ISIS will continue. This is going to be an area of turbulence for a very long time to come, and will be one of the major factors in the geopolitics of the coming half century. And we're not going to solve it with American military power exclusively, although we must be prepared to use it when we want. But keep in mind, ISIS is an offshoot of al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda was an offshoot of the Mujahideen, who we supported, trained, and armed during the Afghan opposition to the Russian invasion. And ISIS will be replaced by something else. It's the circumstances that have to change, and that change has to be led by the people of the region themselves. The vast majority of Muslims are not fanatics like ISIS and Boko Haram in Nigeria. Many of them want the same things that Americans want: a stable environment, a chance to bring up their kids and get them off to a good start in life, to have the kinds of normal life that we want. But they themselves must be willing to stand up and take positions in opposition to these groups and participate in opposition to these groups so that they don't dominate the future of the region as they have in the recent past. The United States, as great and powerful as it is, does not have the capacity to control events everywhere in the world, including and especially the Middle East. We do have the unequaled opportunity to influence events there, and we can do so with a mixture of policies and actions that support those, but we expect and should anticipate that they themselves will help in shaping their own futures in a positive way.
Bill, maybe you could also comment.
No, I'm really depressed.
Yeah, right. The president obviously tomorrow night is going to talk about our actions against ISIS. As a former Secretary of Defense, maybe you want to comment as to how you see our military and what we realistically with allies can do with such a organization that's new but is rather diverse in their geographic areas and their capabilities.
Well, first, I think the president has to get re-energized. It's almost as if he's been on cruise control for the past year or so. And I think if he's going to lead this country and lead our effort in the region, he's got to show that he's energized. And frankly, I haven't seen that. And it's been somewhat disappointing, and I'm not trying to say this on a partisan basis, because I want President Obama to succeed, especially in foreign policy. But I think for his policy to date has been one of disengagement. If you want to say, what is the Obama policy? It's disengagement from Iraq, disengagement from Afghanistan, non-engagement in Syria, non-engagement in Ukraine. That has been the general perception on my part and many other people. So now here we are at this conference. We've seen Putin move in and annex Crimea. He's now talking about helping to declare the eastern part of Ukraine a separate state now. Whether he's able to do that or not remains to be seen, but that's one of his stated, at least, strategic goals, if not one of his tactical moves. And now we have ISIS that has been rampaging through northern Iraq and parts of Syria, and say, what do we do? Well, we've got to show, number one, that we're serious. And this is something that the countries in the region haven't really thought about us for the past couple of years. And I know it's easy to go back and second guess and say the tipping point or the turning point was Syria, when the red line was drawn. And we can argue the merits of that, but when the president said, if you cross this line, there will be consequences, and then turned around and reversed that position, and Putin came in on a white horse and said, I'll help you get rid of the chemical weapons, well, we all breathed a sigh of relief, except the other countries in the region. The Israelis didn't breathe a sigh of relief, the UAE didn't breathe a sigh of relief, nor did the Saudis. And they said, can you really count on the United States? If they draw a line, they damn well better enforce it. And we didn't. And so that has set in motion, at least in part, some of the perceptions in the region that we're not as reliable because, for the very reasons we've been talking about, we become more self-sufficient. We become more of an energy supplier today. So we're disengaging not only in our reliance upon Persian Gulf, or Arabian Gulf oil. They see that as part of our coming home to America, North America, Canada, Mexico, and we're no longer going to be concerned about their security. So that's another element involved. So what we've got to do, number one, rally the NATO countries who have been pretty quiescent. Frankly, they've been how can I say this? They have been disappointing in terms of the willingness to share the burden of being an effective fighting force for all of the 28 members of NATO. We've got to go to the NATO countries, you've got to do more and you've got to be with us, but it can't only be white Western nations. We can't have white Western world going in for a third time into an Arab country or a Muslim country and take the leadership effort. We've got to say, UAE, you've got to be in this with us. Saudis, you've got to be with us. Jordanians, you've got to be with us. This cannot only be our battle for you and for stability. And it picks up on what Senator Mitchell was just saying. It's not our burden alone. They can't do it on their own, frankly. If you talk about the history of that region with Shia and Sunni, well, that goes back centuries. So how do we expect them in the next 30 years to try to reconcile that? We have a role to play. It has to be supportive, but we still have to lead. And they still have to believe us. They have to believe us when we say that we're there, we will help secure and protect you, provided you do the following things. Provided you have an inclusive government in Iraq, which we did not have until recently, and may not have in the future. Provided you're willing to put your country on the line in protecting this vast pool of wealth in the region. I think if we do that, then we can say, yes, we're not prepared to put our Air Force to become the Iranian Air Force or the Iraqi Air Force. We will take limited action from the air. We will have this issue of boots on the ground. We have boots on the ground. We have boots on the ground. So this notion with no boots on the ground, we have them there now. We call them intelligence agents, they're special forces, but they're boots on the ground. And they're going to have to be there if these airstrikes are going to be effective. So we're not going to go in there on the ground all by ourselves, but we are on the ground as we speak, and we need to have Arab participation.
Mark, maybe you could also comment on, obviously, we, as Bill and George have mentioned about Iraq and the changes, and we left there 3 years ago. We're back, obviously, in many ways. We're in the process of leaving Afghanistan relatively shortly. And seeing the instability in the neighborhood, how do you see that playing out? And should we, as a government and as a people, begin to reconsider whether that's the right strategy?
That's a fair question. And, the issues of Afghanistan are kind of enormous. And again, having been the special representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan and focused on it for the better part of a couple of years. I mean, it's a place, I think, where the president was very much engaged. The president's instructions to us were, get this job done. And the only thing I think that you can say at this point, if you follow this issue, is at the moment is, it's just heartbreaking, I think, what's going on in Afghanistan at the moment. Because if you go back 4 or 5 months, they had an election in the spring, which I thought was a testament to the strength of the Afghan people. 7 million people voted. They gave this message that they wanted a democracy. They had a second round, and now their leaders are just clashing over what are clearly sort of personalist and other kind of power issues. And I really worry about this because there's no signed bilateral security agreement with the United States of America. So President Obama has made a decision that we would like to leave 9,800 American forces in Afghanistan on January 1, 2015. But no American president, Republican or Democrat, could leave those forces there without a signed bilateral security agreement. We don't have that agreement because there's no Afghan president. And so there's a series of things that have to happen in Afghanistan. And a little bit like my predecessor here were just talking about in the Middle East, this now really has to come from Afghans. They need to solve their problem, get a president, get this bilateral security agreement signed so that we can leave our forces there, 9,800 of them, on the 1st of January 2015. And only then, Bill, could you decide, well, maybe it should go on a little bit longer. I mean, at the moment, what President Obama has decided is we'll leave the 9,800 there for some months, that number will go down in the middle of 2015 and perhaps go to 0 in 2016. We'll see. If there's a BSA, if the Afghan National Security Forces are prepared to continue to fight, which I think they are, if Afghans are prepared to fight for what they've achieved at enormous cost to us and others and to themselves since 2003, I think there's a good argument to be made, perhaps in 2016, that some force remain to train and equip, fight terrorism, and show the kind of commitment that both Senator Cohen and Senator Mitchell talked about, very important for the United States.
Let me have our panelists move to another part of the world, one that is extremely important, obviously, in a geopolitical and definitely on an economic level, and that's China. They've shown a new aggressiveness to their neighbors, well, it's the Philippines, the Vietnamese, South China Sea, and Japan. Is that a reaction, in your opinion, and you mentioned it, Bill, China, and you're having been there recently, is that a reaction to our pivot by this administration to Asia? Is it a reaction to a belief that the U.S. is coming back with our long-term allies in a stronger way? Or is it just an aggressiveness because they view a weakness about the U.S. in a very broad sense? Yeah.
Well, probably a combination of all of the above. I don't think it per se is a reaction to what is taking place in the Gulf. I think this has been a long time in coming. I first went to China in 1978 and met with Deng Xiaoping, and he laid out how he was going to modernize his country. He was going to restructure it going from an agricultural to an industrial country, and he was going to put the emphasis on economic development. And the last thing he was going to do is talk about reforming their military. Well, the fourth reform is now taking place. They are number 2 in the world in terms of their economy. They're going to be number 1, at least in some category, soon. And they're building a blue water naval capability. They are going to have a military power to match the size of their country. So that's to be expected. They are determined over time to basically push us out of the region, or at least have some kind of an accommodation in which they are more the dominant power. So how do we react to that? I think President Obama it was not a good choice of words when he said we're going to pivot, because a pivot meant, well, we're suddenly turning our attention to the Asia-Pacific region. Not so. We've been there since World War II. We have been the reason China's been able to develop, because we've created stability there. So now we have a situation which they are growing up and saying, but this is our territory. And you see this in each of their movements against Vietnam, putting an oil rig or a second oil rig off the coast of Vietnam. You see it in terms of their claiming of the islands, Senkaku, and with Japan, and it goes on. And I think that they will go as far as they can without any kind of resistance being shown. What the president said is we're going to, let's say, re-energize our focus or re-emphasize our focus on the Asia-Pacific region, as we should. Half the world's population is there. Most of the world's commerce is going to be coming through that part of the world. So we have to be there even more than we have been. What are we doing? We're putting a small contingent of forces, 2,500 Marines in Darwin, in Australia. We're rotating 4 ships, littoral combat ships, LCSs, through Singapore. We're not basing them there, just rotating them through. We're signing a new agreement with the Philippines in terms of having access to facilities in the Philippines again. And yes, we're talking to Vietnam. We don't expect to have a base in Cam Ranh Bay. And we're reinforcing our relationship with Japan, encouraging the Japanese to take a more open and contributory role in terms of security in the region. Plus, we are doing our best to establish a very long-term sustained relationship with India. Now, from the Chinese perspective, what you're doing is you're trying to contain us. Our answer is we're not trying to contain you because you can't be contained. What we are trying to do is show you that we have these relationships with these democratic countries throughout the region, and we want to encourage you to use your growing power in a way that is constructive and integrated into the international community rather than using it as a sheer power. And I pointed out, I think, in some of these past conferences, Joe Nye had a wonderful book years ago called The Paradox of American Power. And that is that if one country is seen as being too powerful, other countries, even your allies, will align themselves in ways to restrain you. The same thing is true about China. That once they show the power that they have, other countries get scared. They say, whoa, we didn't realize they were going to be this aggressive. And so you see the role of the ASEAN countries now calling upon the United States to show a little more presence over here. Diplomacy, economic development, and yes, military. Not to stick a finger in the eye of the Chinese, just to remind them that you're still here and that we want them to be a player in a positive way and not a negative way. So that's how we have to keep these lines of communication open. We have to agree that we're going to disagree on some issues, contest them where it's important to contest them without going to war. But it's going to be a challenge because the Chinese are feeling their power. They're seeing that we're somewhat in retreat. And if you look at this, their defense budgets are growing. They're starting from a much lower level. You know, but $200 billion in China goes a lot further than $400 billion does in the United States. So they're starting from a lower level, but they're investing more in their military, and they're looking at our budget, which is going down. So you start to see these asymmetries that are they're being developed or perceived, and it causes other countries to make different calculations. Do I want to be aligned with China because they're in my neighborhood, or do I want to rely upon Washington, which still can't make an agreement on a budget, and still is in a state of dysfunctionality? Those are the kinds of things that we worry about when we try to look at our Congress and say, it's important that we send a signal that we're a serious country, that we're committed to the virtues that have made us so strong, that we have some fiscal sanity in our parliament. We don't. We have an $18 trillion debt, and it climbs by $500 billion every year. So we've got to get serious at home, as Ambassador Grossman was saying. You can't be strong abroad if you're not strong at home. And that's the signal we've got to send to the Chinese, and to do so in a way that doesn't provoke them into a nationalistic reaction.
The Chinese are a talented, energetic, hardworking people who place a high value on education and material success in life. And they have done remarkably well in the past few decades, but we have a tendency to overstate the strengths of our adversaries and underestimate our own strengths in this country. The most revolutionary thing about the American Revolution was that it established the principle, now universally accepted, although not applied everywhere, that the only legitimate source of authority for governments is the consent of the governed. Russia, the Soviet Union imploded, even though Gorbachev proposed to give them economic freedom and not full political freedom. And the question of the 21st century will be whether China will be the first country ever to be able to give its people full economic freedom, but deny it free choice in political matters. I doubt they will be able to do so. I think they will have to move toward a form of democratic governance, although it's clearly a long way away, as you can see in what's occurring in Hong Kong now. But they face tremendous problems to go along with their economic growth. First off, the only source of authority for their government now is continued economic growth and providing economic opportunities for their people. A linchpin of that is access to the American market. And they cannot take the risk of having the American market closed to them because it would be politically fatal for their government. Secondly, their population will remain stagnant. In 2060, it'll be the same as it is now, 1.3 billion, except it'll be much older. They face serious domestic unrest over pollution and other problems, even as their use of coal increases dramatically and pollution has reached epidemic levels in some of their major cities. So while we should hope that they succeed and prosper in broadening their middle class and giving people a stake in a society and gradually, through evolution, democratize, I don't think that they will, in any real sense, challenge us for, as the dominant world power, economic and military, certainly within the next several decades. I do think that we should not take the position that conflict is inevitable and that we should be encouraging peaceful resolution of disputes between them and their neighbors and any disputes that we have, even as we at the same time make certain that we have the military strength to deny them opportunity if they choose that route.
We probably have time for one or two questions from the audience. We've got people with microphones, so anyone wants to raise their hand or stand up and ask a question, and if you want to direct the question directly to one of the panelists or to the group, please do. So if anyone has any questions, we have one right over here. If you could bring a microphone over.
Thankfully, we haven't heard much. Thankfully, we haven't heard much about North Korea in the past 24 hours. So I thought I would break that and ask you what any of you may think about the threat from North Korea.
Mark.
Oh, thanks. Well, actually, it goes exactly to what we were talking about before. I think the threat from North Korea is enormous. They have a nuclear program. They don't seem to be particularly rational. They threaten two minimum of not just allies of the United States, but treaty allies of the United States of America. But it goes precisely to the point I think we've been trying to get at through quite a lot of this conversation. Can you solve the problem in North Korea without having some cooperation with China? Don't think so. Can you solve the problem in North Korea without having some kind of cooperation with Russia? I don't think so. And so as you sit in the White House and you try to imagine what it's like to be making decisions across the broad scope of the challenges, you say to yourself, well, I'd like to be tough on Russia because of what they've done with Ukraine, but what about North Korea? I want to be tough with China because of I don't know what, and what about North Korea? And so, enormous challenge. It's about strengthening our allies, as we've talked about before, but it's also a reminder about cooperation and confrontation at the same time with some of the more challenging countries in the world.
In the back, or against the wall there?
Thank you. Thank you very much for the panel. My question for you is on Iran. One of you mentioned earlier that Putin's budgetary breakdown is $110 a barrel of oil, and that the projections are that it's not going to get there in the near future. Having said that, if Iran were to acquire a nuclear weapon, it would all of a sudden control the trade route for oil in the Persian Gulf, and particularly the Strait of Hormuz. And we know that in recent time they've threatened to close off the Strait of Hormuz, which would increase the price of oil significantly. And if they were to achieve nuclear weapon capabilities, what's to stop them from actually closing the Strait of Hormuz? In that context, we are relying on Russia as part of the P5+1 to be part of the solution with respect to the Iranian nuclear program. And I understand that Russia doesn't want Iran to develop a nuclear weapon because it's their neighbor. But at the same time, having them develop a nuclear weapon inures to their benefit. So how do you guys see the Iran situation working out with respect to the pursuit of nuclear weapons in the context of Russian supremacy?
George?
I think that Iran's acquisition of a nuclear weapon would be a very dangerous occurrence, which I think will be prevented by the United States should Iran make the decision to leave the talks, or if the talks are unsuccessful, and embark on that course. I think it's not just the threat which you described that it poses in the immediate region, but I think it's a broader threat in terms of nuclear non-proliferation. The United States led the world into the nuclear age and has led the effort over the past more than half century to limit the dissemination of these weapons with considerable success. There are now 9 countries who have a nuclear weapon. Iran is seeking to make it 10. There are many times that 10 countries who have the capacity to produce nuclear weapons, but have refrained from doing so in reliance largely upon the United States and the nuclear non-proliferation regime. Were Iran to achieve a weapon, it would, in my judgment, almost certainly touch off a serious race for a weapon in the Middle East itself, think Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Egypt, Turkey, perhaps others. And I think there's a great danger that that would spread to Asia, and you could have you could go from 9 to 29 in a very short period of time, which would, of course, threaten stability, not just in the possibility that nations with such weapons might use them, but you dramatically increase the possibility of leakage to a non-governmental organization that would have it. Now, it is, of course, the truth that in the 9 countries that possess nuclear weapons, including the United States, the public believes that their country should have a weapon, but that others should not, by overwhelming margins, approaching and in some cases exceeding 90%. So we should not expect the people of Iran to be any different from Americans, from British, from French, from Israelis, from Pakistanis and Indians, those who possess such weapons. What we have to do, I think, is to make the case that for them, the course chosen by dozens of other countries, Germany, Japan, Canada, Australia, name them across the globe, who could produce a nuclear weapon have voluntarily refrained from doing so because they perceive it in their national interest to act in that way. And with the experience of the recent effect of sanctions, which has been severe in Iran and clearly is what brought them to the table as a precedent, I think an effective case can be made to them that while they may want one as a matter of national pride, their national interest lies in not obtaining one and in pursuing a course of better relations, greater trade, and improvement of life for the people of their country. That, I think, is the approach that the President has taken, to his great credit, in the face of considerable opposition in this country to that, particularly in the Congress. We don't know whether it will pay off or not, because that will depend. The Iranians really are the ones who have to make a choice, and I hope and pray that they'll make the right and sensible choice, because I think if they don't, there will be severe consequences and the possibility of conflict in the region.
Thank you, Senator Mitchell. On behalf of
Could I just say a word here?
Yes, you can, sir.
I've never yet been with him when I've had the last word.
I was just going to say that I had a response to offer, but Senator Mitchell has a plane to catch, and I did not want him to be walking off the stage as I was culminating. And so I yield the balance of the time I would have had and simply say that I support Senator Mitchell's having the last word.
So on behalf of everybody in the room, I think we've been privileged to hear from these 4 distinguished Americans who have done such a wonderful job in serving our country and giving us just a little bit of insight into this incredibly complicated world in which we live in today. So thank you very much.